So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Introduction to Cultural Studies. We just finished Michel Foucault's What is an Author, and today we'll start with a new text, and that is Ian Hacking's The Social Construction of What. Now before I begin with this text, before you dive into the text, I'll spend some time talking about this text because this particular book is unlike any other book that we're covering in this course. In terms of its thematic content, in terms of its argument, it's actually quite different. It's actually quite opposite to many of the other texts that we may have covered so far. So as the very title suggests, the social construction of what? It's a critique. This book is a critique to a certain extent of constructivism. You know, it's a critique of this idea of constructedness, this idea of that everything is constructed, it's a social construct, etc. And it looks at the reductionism of that particular argument of this entire constructed quality, this entire constructed question. So the social construction of what is basically an awareness. It's basically used to design to alert us to the fact that there are certain things such as immigration. There are certain things such as the female question, feminism, law, nationalism, etc. So these are things which are very real things, and these are very pertinent things. These affect us in our daily discourses of life. These affect us in the way we live our lives. So to purely look at these categories as constructs, as social constructs, could be reductionist in quality. Now obviously Ian Hacking is one of the finest philosophers we have today, and he's written a series of books from mad travelers to you can talk about almost everything. He's written on some very, very important topics. So the social construction of what becomes just one more book that Hacking writes in a series of really phenomenal texts. But this book is quite provocative in some sense, and like I said, as you may have guessed by now, this goes against some of the things that we have been covering. But actually, if you read this book, you find it appears to go against the idea of constructedness, the idea of constructivism, etc. But actually it isn't. It's a book that looks at the entire idea of social construction, or the construction of ideas, the construction of categories. It's a very complex process. So it alerts us to the complexity of this phenomenon, right? Rather than reducing it to a pure textuality, to a pure constructed quality, it actually brings in many of the parameters, many of the conditions which are sometimes eluded, which are sometimes overlooked, and this entire idea of constructivism, right? So it's in that sense as a critique of constructivism, but it's also it also calls for a more complex understanding of constructivism. So the references to Judith Butler, for instance, in this text, and Hacking quite clearly lauds Butler. He appreciates Butler. He talks about Butler as someone who's a philosopher in a feminist tradition who moves away from the idea of pure constructedness, right? So she moves away, according to Hacking, from looking at gender as just a construct, as just a social construct. But actually, like I said at the very beginning of this course, these are things which are entanglements of the constructed quality and the natural quality, the organic and the inorganic, the artificial and the abstract, the natural and the artificial, the material and the non-material. So these are the entanglements that we're looking at. So if we are to make the argument that everything is a social construct and just that, then obviously there is a risk of reductionism. And this particular book, The Social Construction of What, is a very important warning against that kind of reductionism. It's designed to be a warning. It's designed to caution us, to guard us against that kind of reductionism. So in that sense, it's a very important book. But it appears, as I mentioned, it appears to be doing something which is quite contrary to what we have been doing in this particular course. And I've chosen this book very deliberately, just to get a more nuanced, a more balanced understanding of the construction of culture, right? So when we talk about culture as a construct, of course, what we mean is it's a series of material abstract apparatus which are constantly being entangled in different economic, historical situations. But that obviously is a point, that it's a very complex phenomenon. It brings in many factors which are historical, which are biological, which are ideological. So we need to take the entire parameter, the entire corpus into account. But if we sort of just pinpoint and if we sideline everything else and just emphasize and underline the social constructedness of culture, and look at culture as purely a social construct. If you look at gender as purely a social construct, language as purely a social construct, then it becomes reductionist, right? So over here, Hacking is actually calling forth for a more robust, a more complex understanding of culture. He is not moving away from the idea of social constructiveness. He's not moving away from the idea of constructivism, but he calls for a more complex constructivism, something which takes into account various other factors which may not be social in quality. It may be biological, it may be physiological, it may be emotional, and what we'll do in this book, as we study this book, we'll just study the introduction in a very thoroughly and very so intensely and extensively, because the introduction really lays out the whole book, and it talks about different issues such as emotion, affect, nationalism, the refugee problem, feminism, and it takes up each of these categories and sort of highlights how there's always this risk if you're looking at these categories as purely social constructs. Then obviously you're overlooking many of the factors which may play a very vital role in an understanding of these categories. So in that sense, it's a very important book, and also it gives us a very nuanced understanding of culture. So otherwise, there's always this seduction of constructivism. You know, you sort of end up arguing that everything is a social construct and nothing else. So every category that we see, economy, for instance, language, for instance, emotion, everything is a social construct, and you're basically sidelining, you're basically effacing and doing away with all the other investments into this category. So in that sense, this book is a very important book, and I've chosen this very deliberately for this course on cultural studies. Now, Hacking is from Canada. He's a Canadian philosopher who works in the United States, and there are lots of references to Canada. So it talks about, for instance, the Ministry of Multiculturalism in Canada, and it says the whole idea of multiculturalism was prevalent even before, in Canada, prevalent even before the term became fashionable in the Western world. He keeps referring to the Canadian immigration policies, and he keeps referring to the Canadian condition in politics, etc. So in that sense, there's a topicality about the book. There is a very local character, a very local quality about this book in terms of references that Hacking is using. But at the same time, these references can be used to connect to a broader analysis, a broader argument. And this is, again, one of the hallmarks of great philosophers and great writers, that they take out something specific, they take out something micro and manage to analyze it in a way that it connects to a macro problem. So we just saw Foucault, for instance, before this text, we finished with Foucault's What is an Author, when we saw that how, despite looking at the author as a function, looking at the author as an ideological discursive function, what Foucault ends up doing or ends up achieving is a magnificent discourse analysis, or a magnificent analysis of discourse formation. How is the discourse formed? How is the discourse reformed with different historical investments, or different economic, linguistic, ideological investments? So what is an author is about the discourse function of the author, but at the same time, it also becomes a text about discourse function or discourse analysis. So that is one of the characteristics of great thinkers, that they manage to take something micro and local and topical and then end up forming a very elegant theory, a very elegant argument, which can be used potentially to connect to broader topics which may not relate to that particular topic alone. Okay, so the social construction of what does something similar. So Hacking is a philosopher in that tradition who takes up a very topical thing, a very micro thing in some sense. It gives very micro specific examples, especially from Canada, and yet we find the way he theorizes the problem, it becomes applicable to almost any context, and that therein lies the richness of this particular text. So, and the other thing that you find when you read the text, and as you will in great details, it's got a very interesting style. It's got a tongue-in-cheek quality about it. It's sometimes flippant, very deliberately flippant, and it sometimes takes up a sort of a non-academic tone, which actually makes it more sophisticated, which actually makes it more interesting for us today, because he's obviously using a vast area, a vast range of references. He's talking about things which are profound and political and deep, and phenomenal and significant at a macro level, but also equally he's referring to things which are more micro in quality. And this juxtaposition of the macro and the micro, this juxtaposition of the really significant and the very immediately interesting, is what makes this book a very complex text in cultural studies. So let's begin with the social construction of what. And this is chapter 1, the introduction, which we will essentially cover in details quite extensively, because this sort of lays out, as I say, this lays out the plan for the whole book, and this gives you a flavor for the whole book in terms of what the book achieves to do, what this book aims to do, and it does quite successfully, I think. Okay, so this is Ian Hacking's introduction to his really important book, what the social construction of what, and he gives a series of references, a series of catalogue from a library catalogue actually, and he says each of these terms can be seen as social constructions, and then he goes on and debunks the whole idea of constructivism in a very sometimes flippant, sometimes really profound way. Okay, so and then he goes on to sort of see how these are more complex conditions, more complex categories, and require and demand attention from various perspectives, and not just from social perspectives, and not just from a social constructivist perspective, because that is reductionist. Okay, so the very opening is sort of semi-serious. It has a mocking quality to it. It has a flippant quality to it, and that makes it really interesting. It gets your attention immediately. And he asks, what a lot of things are said to be socially constructed is an exclamation mark. It's not something you see at the beginning of every academic book, but this is what makes it interesting and quite offbeat, I think. Here are some construction titles from a library catalogue, and it gives a range of titles. Authorship, brotherhood, the child view of television, danger, emotions, facts, gender, homosexual culture, illness, knowledge, literacy, the medicalized immigrant, nature, oral history, postmodernism, hoax, reality, serial homicide, technological systems, urban schooling, vital statistics, women refugees, youth homelessness, Zulu nationalism. So, I mean, these are sort of random references, but these are picked very deliberately, these are selected very deliberately by Hacking our way up, because he will now go through most of these terms and see how each of these terms require an attention which is not just from a social constructivist perspective. It must be more complex, it must be more rich, more robust than that. Okay, so these are our references, these are random catalogues that he offers. And then he goes on to say in the next page, which should be on the screen, not to mention deafness, mind, panic, the 80s and extraordinary signs, individual people are also qualified. At a workshop on teenage pregnancy, an overworked director of a Roman Catholic welfare agency said, and I myself am, of course, a social construct, each of us is. Then there is experience. Scholars and activists within feminism and disability rights have demonstrated that experiences of being female or having a disability are socially constructed. Right? So he talks about different kinds of social constructions, and he said, it's possible that some individuals, especially individuals working in the feminist tradition or disability studies, they look at themselves as social constructs, and there is another way of looking at it. So it's not just about references, it's not just about texts and books and issues, political issues. It can also be directed towards selves, and obviously he's being slightly sarcastic over here. And then he goes on to say, my alphabetical list is taken from titles of the form of the social construction of X or constructing X. I left X out of my alphabet for lack of a book, and because it allows me to use X as a filler, a generic label for what is constructed. Talk of social construction has become common coin, valuable for political activists and familiar to anyone who comes across current debates about race, gender, culture, or science. Why? So this is the point where Hacking is asking why. So why is it that the entire idea of social construction, especially when it comes to issues such as race, gender, politics, language, why has it become fashionable? To what extent is social constructivism fashionable? To what extent is it reductionist? To what extent is it sophisticated? Right? So these are the questions that Hacking keeps on asking in this book. Okay, and then he gives a very balanced understanding of social construction. He acknowledges the fact, like any thinker would, that the entire idea of social construction can be very liberating, can be something which can be emancipatory, can rescue people, can give people a certain sense of solace, can uplift people psychologically, discursively, etc. But at the same time, there's also a danger, the risk of reductionism, the risk of reification, if you will, where if you bring everything down to social construct, then you're taking away, like I said at the beginning of this lecture, you're taking away some of the more complex conditions which are axiomatically associated with these categories. Okay, and then he says, this is a point where he gives a very balanced and nuanced argument of this entire analysis. For one thing, the idea of social construction has been wonderfully liberating. It reminds us, say, that motherhood and its meanings are not fixed and inevitable. The consequence of childbearing and rearing. They are the product of historical events. social forces and ideology. Mothers who accept current canons of emotion and behavior may learn that the way they are supposed to feel and act are not ordained by human nature or the biology of reproduction. They need not feel quite as guilty as they are supposed to if they do not obey either the old rules of family or whatever is the official psychopediatric rule of the day, such as you must bond with your infant or you both will perish. So this is what I meant at the beginning when I said, this is not really a flippant book which says there's nothing called social construction. Rather, hacking is intensely aware of the benefits and advantages and privileges that come from the idea of social construction, especially when it comes to something as apparently biological as motherhood. So he acknowledges and accepts, and he's first to say, well, there are certain things, or certain issues which are deeply constructed socially, like motherhood, for instance. So, and he says the entire guilt of not being a good mother, the entire guilt of not doing certain things, which automatically mean you're not bonding with the child. I mean, this guilt, this emotion of guilt, it can be a social construct, because the entire idea of motherhood is dependent on certain, on a location and a particular historical time, and there are certain psychopediatric rules which are dominant at that particular time. So you have to conform to these rules. If you're not conforming to these rules, then you may end up being called or classified as a bad mother. So mothering is a very good example of social construct, and hacking is the first to point that out. So again, we can see that he's actually talking about social construction as a more complex category. So he's the first to say that social construction can be liberating. It can actually open us up to more discursive possibilities. It can open us up to questioning some dominant discourses, etc. And so in that sense, it can be liberating. In that sense, it can be sort of useful at an immediately human level. Okay, but then he goes on to say that unfortunately, social construction analysis do not always liberate. Now he looks at the flip side of the coin, the other side of the coin, and he says that it's also possible that social construction analysis can be the opposite of liberating. It can be reifying, it can be reductionist in more sense than one. Take anorexia. So he talks about, he uses some very provocative examples. So anorexia, for instance, is a very useful example, and also a very disturbing example. It's about people who have this compulsive habit of not eating and throwing up in order to fit into a particular body image. So anorexia becomes a psychological condition, but to look at anorexia as a purely social condition, as a purely social construct, is a fallacy according to hacking, because that takes away the entire medical, the entire biological, the entire the metabolic investment, the metabolic parameter, the metabolic coordinates in anorexia, and it just makes it into a social disease. So that is, in hacking's terms, a bit of a fallacy. It's an error. It's a discursive simplification, and in that sense, it ends up being a reductionist, and it should be avoided in any sophisticated analysis. So unfortunately, social construction analysis do not always liberate. Take anorexia, the disorder of adolescent girls and young women who seem to value being thin above all else. So again, this whole idea of fitting into a particular body image, that becomes a compulsion, that becomes an anxiety, which can extend into a pathological condition. They simply will not eat. Although anorexia has been known in the past, and even the name is a couple of 100 years old, it surfaced in a modern world in the early 1960s. The young women who were seriously affected resist treatment. Any number of fashionable and often horrible cures have been tried, and none works reliably. In any intuitive understanding of social construction, anorexia must in part be some sort of social construction. It is, at any rate, a transient mental illness, flourishing only in some places at some times, but that does not help the girls and young women who are suffering. Social construction theses are liberating chiefly for those who are on the way to being liberated, mothers whose consciousness has already been raised, for example. So now he's giving a more pragmatic reading. So he's saying social construction analysis can often be completely non-liberating. It may not be any helpful at all to people who are actually suffering from that particular condition, which is a very complex condition. And he's saying social construction can work only with people who are already on the way out of that particular discursive dominance. So for instance, if we go back to the motherhood example that hacking offered, so people who realize the constructed quality of motherhood, the constructed quality of pediatric science, psychopediatric condition at a particular time, and how that is constructed, and how the need to conform to that construct is also a construct. People who acknowledge and realize it and are actually moving away from that kind of a dominant, that kind of a domination, they can find social construction analysis useful, but not people who are actually suffering, not people who are actually in the middle of it. So anorexia, for example, is a real medical condition. It's a condition which involves the metabolism, involves the body, involves the nervous system, involves the brain, the mind, the human self, self-esteem, etc. So to reduce it all to social construction analysis and to read the entire phenomenon through social construction analysis might be reductionist, and it doesn't help the people, it doesn't liberate the people at all. It just doesn't work in a way that is supposed to work. Okay, and now on page 3, which shall be on the screen, hacking gives a very example of a very notorious phenomenon called Sokal's hoax, which maybe familiar to some of you. So Sokal, who is Alan Sokal, who was a physicist in New York University, he wrote this hoax, this bogus article using postmodernist, post-structuralist theory and rhetoric, and got it published in a very prestigious journal called Social Text. And of course, it was a hoax publication. And later on, Sokal acknowledged that it was a hoax publication, and the whole point was to prove that you can pass it off as a sophisticated article if you just use the right jargon, the right language, the right rhetoric. So that was a big slap in the face for in people working in postmodernist, post-structuralist conditions. So Sokal's hoax became a very vital phenomenon. So everyone referred to it, etc. Now hacking, unsurprisingly, takes it up and says how that example can be seen as the flip side of social construction analysis. So if you take social construction analysis too far, if you just reduce yourself to rhetorical and textual analysis of real-world phenomena, then you end up encouraging, then you end up generating the so-called hoax, and it can be more so-called hoax in the times to come. And sometimes those may not be meant as hoaxes; those may be meant as serious arguments, serious and sophisticated academic output. But they are just relying on rhetoric, just relying on a certain kind of jargon in order to prove a point without really engaging with the real condition. So therein lies the risk of social constructivism or social construction analysis, that it ends up being very rarefied and reified. So the reification and rarefication over here, these are two basic accusations that hacking directs against an overdetermination, an overdetermined social construction analysis. Okay, so and he uses a very interesting medical example, a very extreme medical examples of cancer cells, and he says how just like cancer cells can spread and ruin and damage and break an organism, in a very similar way, social construction analysis, like cancer cells, they can spread like viral fever, spread like cancer cells exponentially, and then just completely destroy the organism being over here, academia, or any sophisticated attempt to understand culture. So for all the power to liberate, this is hacking on page 3, which should be on the screen, for all the power to liberate, those very words, social construction, can work like cancerous cells. Once seeded, they replicate out of hand. Consider Alan Sokal's hoax. Sokal, a physicist at New York University, published a learned pastiche of current theory in Social Text, an important academic journal for literary and cultural studies. So, like I said, Sokal just borrowed some jargon, put together some jargon, just passed together certain rhetoric, certain kinds of terms, and then sent it off to a very good journal called Social Text, which actually accepted and published it. So the whole point is you can be a physicist and just appropriate the jargon, appropriate the rhetoric, and get published in one of the leading publishing platforms, this being Social Text, and that obviously becomes a slap in the face, like I said, a great satire, a great reprimand, dressing down to the entire idea of social construction. Okay, so this particular journal was an important academic journal for cultural and literary studies. The editors included it in a special issue dedicated to the science wars. In an almost simultaneous issue of Lingua Franca, a serious variant of People magazine aimed at professors and the ilk, Sokal owned up to the mischief. So he sort of owned up, he acknowledged, and that was the whole point. He would sort of prove to the world that, look, I can be a physicist and get published in a very sophisticated literary cultural journal, but just appropriating the rhetoric, and that's all I need, the rhetoric. Okay, I don't need anything else to get published. Sokal's confession used the term social construction just twice in a 5-page essay. So in that confession essay that he wrote to Lingua Franca and a variant of People magazine, Sokal owned up to what he had done and used the word social construction twice in a 5-page essay. Stanley Fish, Dean of Theory, retorted on the op-ed page of the New York Times. There he used the term oris cognates 16 times in a few paragraphs. If a cancer cell did that to a human body, death would be immediate. Excessive use of a vogue toward is tiresome or worse. So the entire idea of social construction became excessive in its use, excessive in its investment. So Stanley Fish, who's obviously one of the key proponents of reader response theory, he countered Sokal in another article in op-ed in New York Times. There he used the term social construction 16 times, or words which meant synonyms of social construction 16 times in order to prove his point. Now, hacking over here is obviously looking at this particular example, this particular phenomenon as an epoch in the entire idea of social construction. This is a starting point where social construction becomes a very fashionable, trendy theory, a very trendy term. But then with the trend comes also a pitfall, comes also the danger of reductionism. Everyone starts using social construction, and every category, every human category, every subcategory, every cultural category are read purely and only to social construction analysis. And that obviously is a great danger according to hacking, because that takes away some of the more complex arguments which are invested in these categories. Okay, in a talk given in Frankfurt a few days after the story broke in May of 1996, I said that Sokal's hoax had now had its 15 minutes of fame. So, initially hacking confesses he did not take it so seriously. He said, well, in Frankfurt I gave a lecture on what I touched upon this topic, and I said Sokal's hoax had had its 15 minutes of fame. So it's like a flash in the pan. It will just come and go. People will forget about it forever. How wrong I was. There are several thousand Sokal entries on the internet. Sokal crystallized something very important for American intellectual life. I say American deliberately. Many of Sokal's targets were French writers, and Sokal's own book on these topics was first published in French. That in turn produced 2 French books, both with the French word impostures in the titles. The European reaction has, however, remained bemused rather than concerned. Plenty of reporting, yes, but not much passion. In late 1997, Sokal had little prominence in Japan, although the most informative Sokal website anywhere had just opened in Japanese cyberspace. Students of contemporary American modes have an obligation to explain the extraordinary brouhaha that Sokal provoked in his own country. My aim is not to give a social history of our times explaining all that, but to analyze the idea of social construction, which has been on the warpath over 3 decades before Sokal. Hence, I shall have almost nothing to say about the affair. Readers who want a polemical anthology of American writing siding with Sokal may enjoy Courage. So he just refers to Sokal and moves on, and then gives a reference that people might find useful if they want to find out more about it. A reference to Courage. But he said the Sokal phenomenon is not really a flash in the pan. It happened, but then it opened up to more such incidents in future, which were not, like he said, they may not have considered themselves to be hoax or bogus submissions. They probably looked at themselves as very serious submissions. And therein lies the danger of social constructivism, or the social construction analysis, that they just use. There's always this idea of appropriating a certain rhetoric, appropriating a certain language, appropriating a certain idiom, a certain analysis, and looking at everything without analysis. So that obviously narrows down the entire epistemic content of that analysis, because it just relies completely on one kind of content, one brand of perspective, one brand of reading, one discourse of reading, and completely effacing, completely disregarding any of the readings that might be possible in that situation. Okay, so I stopped this lecture here today. This is the opening of Ian Hacking's Social Construction Now What, and we'll continue with this introduction in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.